Madam President.
The Senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I rise today to continue to express my views in support of the nomination of Professor Goodwin Liu, a nominee, as you know, to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Many different things have been said on the floor here in recent hours, and I rise to offer my comments on some of the concerns that are being debated. For once, it is great to actually hear debate on the floor of this chamber. I have been here, as you know, Madam President, just 6 months. And as someone who is new to the Judiciary Committee, new to the debates and dialogue of this chamber, I am struck at the things that I'm hearing about Professor Goodwin Liu and the significant divergence between what I have found in questioning him and looking at his record and speaking to my colleagues and in what I've heard here on the floor just today. So I will do my best, if I might, Madam President, in a few moments, to try and lay out what I see as the real record of the real Professor Goodwin Liu, our nominee to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Some have come to the floor today and argued that Professor Liu lacks the candor or the temperament to serve on a circuit court. And as someone who clerked for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals for a distinguished judge, I will suggest something that I think is a commonplace, which is that candor and an appropriate temperament are critical to service on a circuit court of appeal. A lot of these charges raised against Professor Liu seem to center on a few comments that Professor Liu made during the nomination hearing for now Justice Alito, or some purported deficiencies in his disclosures to the Judiciary Committee. Let me speak briefly to both of those, if I might. Professor Liu has apologized at length and in detail for the intemperate tone of one brief passage that he wrote as a part of his testimony before the Judiciary Committee during the Alito nomination hearings now some 6 years ago. I take this apology at face value. I take his expression of regret at the tone at face value. But anyone who has taken the time to meet him, to interview him, to question him, I think has to conclude that despite this one brief episode of the use of intemperate language, he is not an intemperate person. In fact, the American Bar Association, as my colleague Senator Boxer pointed out previously today, specifically considered Professor Liu's temperament when it gave him its highest rating of unanimously well qualified in their recommendation for his consideration by this body. Let me next turn briefly, if I might, to claims about candor before the committee, which I believe are equally unfounded. He has, in fact, testified before the Judiciary Committee for a total of 5 hours and answered hundreds of questions and requests for additional information. He has been sharply criticized for missing some documents from his initial response to what is a searching committee questionnaire. But I will comment for those following this that Professor Liu has been a prolific scholar and speaker. He is someone who has published extensively. He is someone who has spoken extensively. And he is the first controversial circuit court nominee to have his confirmation take place not just in the computer age, but in the YouTube age, when a combination of cell phones and video recorders have literally made a record of every brown bag lunch, every 5-minute speech, every off-the-cuff remark made by this nominee before us. The argument that his need to supplement the record to include some documents not initially produced, in my view, and that somehow that reflects some lack of candor, and that somehow that suggests a lack of truthfulness that should disqualify him, not for a vote, but not even for consideration of a vote, I think is wholly without merit. As the chief White House ethics counsel under President Bush, Richard Painter, has written, Professor Liu's, quote, original answers to the questions asked by the Judiciary Committee were a careful and good faith effort to supply the Senate with the information it needed to assess his nomination, close quote. It means a great deal to me that someone like Mr. Painter concluded that Professor Liu provided a lot more information than most nominees do in similar circumstances, and frankly, it seems to me overreaching to try and suggest that simply because in the YouTube age, this professor who provided us with hours of testimony, pages of responses, failed to notice the committee about some brown bag lunches and off-the-cuff comments does not rise to the standard of justifying a filibuster. Let me next turn to the suggestion that he is insufficiently qualified to hold the position of circuit judge. An important concern, because we want judges of judicial temperament, of openness and candor and good character, and also those who are sufficiently experienced. As I said a moment ago, the American Bar Association, after a searching, confidential, comprehensive review of his qualifications, concluded he was unanimously well qualified, its highest possible rating. In previous nomination debates, senators of this body, senators of the other party, have touted the ABA rating as a comprehensive and exhaustive evaluation that provides valuable insight that ought to be trusted. Several folks, several members of this body, several senators, including some who spoke immediately before me, have made those exact references to the value of the ABA rating process. Reasonable minds may be able to differ on the margins, but it is not credible, in my view, to claim that a candidate with Professor Liu's remarkable legal education, long record of public service and experience, and the ABA's highest rating is not qualified to serve on a circuit court. The charges or suggestions that Professor Liu is unqualified because he's young or because he lacks significant courtroom experience are also hollow and one-sided when we look at the real record. Since 1980, 14 nominees younger than Professor Liu, advanced by Republican presidents, have all been confirmed. Judges, for example, Neil Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit, who was 38 when nominated. Judge Brett Kavanaugh, an acquaintance and I would say friend of mine from law school, now in the D.C. Circuit, was 38 when nominated. Now Justice Samuel Alito was 39 when nominated to the Third Circuit. Republican nominees with similar or lesser practical courtroom experience than Professor Liu have also been nominated and confirmed. Circuit Court Judges Frank Easterbrook and Harvey Wilkinson were both under 40 when nominated without any practicing legal experience at all. And yet this lack of practical experience didn't prevent either of these judges from becoming among the best respected, most widely regarded in their respective circuits. I would ask that my colleagues seriously consider instead looking at the standard that was applied when a similarly controversial professor came before this body. I was not here at the time, but I understand from the record that Democratic senators approached the nomination of Michael McConnell, President George W. Bush's nominee to the 10th Circuit, in a way that was generous, that accepted at face value some of his assertions. Like Professor Liu, Professor McConnell was a widely regarded law professor who was nominated to a federal appeals court without having first served as a judge. Many Democratic senators at the time had concerns about Professor McConnell's conservative writings, which included strong opposition to Roe v. Wade, congressional testimony that the Violence Against Women Act was unconstitutional, and harsh criticism of the Supreme Court's 8-1 decision in the Bob Jones case. Despite these positions, which one could argue are at the outer edge, even the extreme, of the legal canon of the time, Professor McConnell was confirmed not after a filibuster, not after a long series of grinding nomination hearings and public discourse, but Professor McConnell was confirmed by voice vote of this chamber just one day after his nomination was confirmed by the Judiciary Committee. In supporting Professor McConnell's nomination, Democratic senators of the time credited his assurances that he understood the difference between the role of law professor and judge, that he respected and would follow precedent. In my view, the senators of this body should credit similar assurances that Professor Liu has provided during his confirmation hearings and that Professor Liu has provided to me in an individual interview in answer to hundreds of written questions from members of the committee, as well to in answer to challenges presented here. Let me next turn, if I might, to some challenges or concerns that have been raised about Professor Liu's view on education. A bipartisan group of 22 leaders in education law, policy, and research have written to support Professor Liu's nomination and to highlight his scholarship and reputation in the field of education law and policy. They wrote, and I quote, "Based on his record, we believe Professor Liu is a careful, balanced, and intellectually honest scholar with an outstanding set of academic qualifications and the proper temperament to be a fair and disciplined judge." Later, they wrote in this letter that his work is nuanced and balanced, not dogmatic or ideological. And I ask unanimous consent, Madam President, that this letter be included in the record.
Without objection.
During his confirmation hearings, Professor Liu testified to the Judiciary Committee, and I quote, "I absolutely do not support racial quotas, and my writings, I think, have made very clear that I believe them to be unconstitutional." Professor Liu also stated to the committee that I think affirmative action, as it was originally conceived, was a time-limited remedy for past wrongs. And I think that is the appropriate way to understand what affirmative action is. These two statements, which reflect Professor Liu's testimony to the committee, are well within the mainstream. Professor Liu has written and spoken about his support for diversity in public schools. And in my view, there is nothing extreme in this view. Ever since Brown versus Board of Education was decided by a unanimous Supreme Court in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States has recognized the legitimacy of state action to desegregate schools. In fact, the Supreme Court upheld the use of race as one factor in admissions decisions in the 2003 case Grutter versus Bollinger. Although some on the far right of the Supreme Court have argued that both Brown and Grutter should be disregarded to the extent they recognize the permissibility of efforts to achieve diversity in public institutions, it is, I would argue, those justices out of step with the mainstream of federal jurisprudence and of the constitutional tradition of this country. Even in its most recent case on point, the 2007 Supreme Court decision Parents Involved versus Seattle School District, which struck down a specific desegregation program, 5 of the 9 justices that made up the majority opinion agreed with Liu that achieving diversity remains a compelling governmental interest. The notion that somehow Professor Liu is an ideologue on these issues is belied by his actual record. As a scholar, Professor Liu has supported market-based reforms to promote schoolhouse diversity, reforms that are often labeled conservative. Professor Liu believes and has written in support of school choice and school vouchers, stating that they have a role to play in improving educational opportunities for disadvantaged children. He has publicly advocated for these programs on a nationwide scale, earning praise from conservatives in the process. Clint Bolick, director of the conservative Goldwater Institute, referred to by my colleague Senator Boxer previously, has written, quote, "I have known Professor Liu, and since reading an influential law review article that he co-authored," he goes on to say, "supporting school choice as a solution to the crisis of inner-city public education, I believe it took a great deal of courage for him to take such a strong public position, and I find Professor Liu to exhibit fresh, independent thinking and intellectual honesty." He closes his letter by saying, "Professor Liu clearly possesses the scholarly credentials and experience to serve with distinction on this important circuit court." Professor Liu has, in my view, made very clear that he understands the difference between being a law professor, a scholar, an advocate, and a judge, and has assured us during his nomination hearings before the committee and again in personal conversations with me that he would follow the court's precedent if confirmed. During his confirmation hearings, Professor Liu testified to our committee, quote, "If I were fortunate enough to be confirmed in this process, it would not be my role to bring any particular theory of constitutional interpretation to the job of an intermediate appellate judge. The duty of a circuit judge is to faithfully follow the Supreme Court's instructions on matters of constitutional interpretation, not any particular theory." And so that is exactly what I would do. I would apply the applicable precedents to the facts of each case. As I said before, and I will say again, this quote, I believe, from Professor Liu deserves exactly the same weight and deference and confidence as similar assertions by then Professor McConnell, now Circuit Court Judge McConnell, when he was confirmed by voice vote of this chamber. To speak otherwise, I think, is to do violence to the tradition of deference to those who give sworn testimony, to hearings, and to the deliberations of this body. Last, let me turn to some points that were raised just recently about whether or not Professor Liu believes that Americans have a constitutional right to welfare benefits, like education, shelter, or health care, and if confirmed, would somehow declare those constitutional rights from the bench. Professor Liu has authored, as I've said, many different law review articles, and in one, the 2008 Stanford Law Review article entitled Rethinking Constitutional Welfare Rights, he in fact criticized another scholar's assertion from a 1969 article that courts should recognize constitutional welfare rights on the basis of a so-called comprehensive moral theory. Professor Liu rejected that. In 2006, he penned a Yale Law Review article that argued that the 14th Amendment authorizes and obligates Congress to ensure a meaningful floor of educational opportunity. His record is replete with sources that make it clear that Professor Liu respects and recognizes the role of this body, of Congress, and the role of the Supreme Court in establishing, interpreting, and applying both precedent and constitutional theory, and that he accepts, acknowledges, and will respect the very real limits on a circuit court judge in innovating in any way. Madam President, in closing, allow me to simply share with you and with the members of this body that new to this body, new to the fights that have divided this chamber and have so, I think, deflected real deliberation on nominees to circuit courts and the Supreme Court, I have taken the time to review his writings, to interview him individually, to attend a nomination hearing, and have come to the conclusion that candidate nominee Professor Goodwin Liu is a qualified, capable, competent, in fact, exceptional legal scholar who understands and will respect the differences between advocacy and scholarship and serving as a member of the Circuit Court in the judiciary of the United States. I urge the members of this body, I urge my colleagues, to take a fresh look at the record and to allow this body to vote. Why on earth this record of this exceptionally qualified man would justify a filibuster is utterly beyond me, and suggests that, unfortunately, we've become mired in partisanship rather than allowing debate and votes on this floor, which, in my view, if we follow the best traditions of this body, would lead to the confirmation of Goodwin Liu to the Ninth Circuit. Thank you. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam President, and I would tell my colleague from Delaware that he makes some very excellent points and very well said. I've spent a number of years, now almost 7, on the Judiciary Committee, and my observations are painfully aware to me about our process. Goodwin Liu is a stellar individual. There's no question about it. He's a stellar scholar. There's no question about it. But my observations have taught me, as we've voted and put judges as the appellate court and to the highest court, that what is said in testimony before the committee really doesn't bear out any impact on what happens once somebody becomes a judge. And my observation is people are who they are. I actually spent a significant time with Goodwin Liu. I think he's a genuine great American. The question, however, is not whether he's a stellar scholar, a stellar intellect, or a great American. The question is do his beliefs match what the Constitution requires of appellate judges and higher judges? And I've come to the conclusion that being stellar, being a great teacher and professor, being a wonderful judge is not enough. And I really take the words to heart that my colleague said, because we all make mistakes. His comments on Judge Alito and Judge Roberts, he said were poor judgment. He shouldn't have done. There's not anybody in this body that hadn't done the same thing. So we can't hold that against him, and I don't. But what I do think matters is whether or not the oath to the Constitution and our laws and our treaties and the foundational documents of our Constitution do matter. And I believe that where we find ourselves today as a country, not having the debate on the Senate floor, as we should be having the debates on the Senate floor, is partially to blame because of where the judges have put us. That they haven't been loyal to the document. They've expanded the Commerce Clause well beyond it's ever anywhere close intent in the General Welfare Clause that now finds us at a time when we're nearing bankruptcy. We can't get out of our problems without retracting tremendously the size and scope of the federal government. We can't grow our economy with the tax revenue increases that are going to be required to get out of this problem. That it comes back down is, what do they really believe about the Constitution? And the best way to find that out is before they were ever thought about being nominated, and before they're trying to be controversial in a teaching environment, is what are their great thoughts and what are their beliefs? And I don't believe professors write articles to be controversial. I think they write articles based on what their learned research tells them. And I just have a frank disagreement with Professor Liu on the role of a federal judge. I actually believe what the Constitution says. And it says the judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this, and the word is this, Constitution, the laws of the United States, and the treaties made, or which shall be made. And the problems I have with Professor Liu is that I believe he advocates for an unconstitutional role for judges. He believes the Constitution is a living document, that it is indeterminate. You know, I recognize I'm just a doctor from Oklahoma and I don't have a law degree, but I can read these words as plain as anybody else. And I don't think they're indeterminate. I think some of the things our founders did were wrong, and we've corrected them through the years, both through wise Supreme Court decisions, but also through amendments to the Constitution. And he also believes that the Constitution should be subject to socially situated modes of reasoning that appeal culturally and historically to contingent meanings. What that says to me is what this says is wide open. And I really like the guy. I got along fabulous with him. He's a wonderful individual. But I don't think that's who we want on the appellate court. And I think what judges say, potential judges say and write, when you take the totality of what they say and write, not what they say at a hearing, because it all changes once they're nominated. What they say and write is very important about what the judge are going to become. And you heard Senator Cornyn relate to Justice Sotomayor based on, here's her testimony, and the first case she does is exactly opposite of what her testimony was, but is totally consistent with what her beliefs were in her writings in previous cases. So, you know, used to, the Judiciary Committee didn't bring the judges before. We looked at the history. Now, let me address something else. What the ABA says doesn't matter to me anymore because there's been a controversial nomination from Oklahoma that the ABA has rated qualified, that 4 distinct people who were interviewed by the ABA said the individual wasn't qualified. That was totally discounted by the ABA. The people that were actually interviewed said the person wasn't qualified. The ABA gave them a qualified rating anyway. These are their peers. So that basis for saying we have qualification is no longer trustworthy in my mind. It hadn't been for some time. I think the due diligence is lacking on the ABA and their method for scoring who is qualified or who is not. The final point that I would make is that although he's written a lot, and a lot of it's been controversial, one of the things that really bothers me is his profound belief that he has the right to use foreign law to interpret the U.S. Constitution. And what that really is a code word for saying is, if I don't like what's written in this document, I'll go find some jurisprudence somewhere else and apply it to this document that gets me the result I want, rather than being truthfully and honestly obedient to what this document says. And I know that sounds overly simple, but it's not. The fact that we've not applying our Constitution and its meaning and what our founders said about what it meant, and we're ignoring it, is one of the things that's put us in the perilous state that we're in today. And we're going to have a great test sometime in the next year on the massive expansion of the Commerce Clause that was put into law through the Affordable Care Act. And I will predict in this body today, if that is upheld, there will be no need for state and local governments anymore, because there will be no limitation on what we as a federal government can do to limit the freedom and free exercise of the 10th Amendment to the states. The idea that you can take what this Constitution very clearly says, all cases in law of equity arising under this Constitution, not foreign law, not foreign constitution, not foreign thought, but our law. It doesn't mean we can't learn from other things, but you can't use foreign law to interpret our Constitution. It is a violation of a judicial oath every time one of our Supreme Court justices references their opinion based on foreign law. It's a violation of their oath, because their oath is to this Constitution, not some other Constitution. And so we see that occasionally, especially in minority opinions, and oftentimes in previous majority opinions that have got our country into the trouble that we're in. So I believe Godwin Liu is a generally wonderful man. He's a stellar intellectual thinker. By reports, he is an outstanding professor and is a great human being. That does not qualify him to be on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. What will qualify him is an absolute fidelity to our Constitution and our future, and not the creative ways that we can change that through our own wills or whims of judges to get a result that's different than what our Constitution would say we should have. And so I regrettably, and truly with regret, will be voting against cloture, because I don't like this process. I think it hurts us. I think it divides our body for his nomination. And my hope would be that we can handle these in the future much better than what we've handled them in the past. And with that, I yield. I see the Assistant Majority Leader on the floor, and I would yield to him.
Madam President.
The Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I have 10 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate with the approval of the minority and majority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, at 2 o'clock we'll have a vote here on the floor. A man is seeking a judgeship. There's no question in anybody's mind that this is a judgeship that should be filled. Professor Goodwin Liu wants to serve on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He was nominated in January of 2009. Here we are in May of 2010. The significance of that delay is the fact that this is a vacancy that causes a problem. The administrative office of the U.S. Court, no political office, but the court's office, declared a judicial emergency in this circuit and said they needed this vacancy filled. So nobody questions that there was at least a sense of urgency in filling the seat. And you ask yourself, well, if the President nominated someone back in January of 2009, why in May of 2010 are we just getting around to it? I think that question needs to be directed to the other side of the aisle. They have found reasons to delay this and to raise questions which have brought us to this moment. So how about this professor? Is he qualified to serve at the second highest level of courts in America, the Ninth Circuit? Well, the American Bar Association didn't waste any time evaluating Professor Goodwin Liu. They awarded him their highest possible rating, unanimously well qualified. And if you look at his background, it's no surprise. He's the son of immigrants. He attended Stanford University, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa, He won a Rhodes Scholarship. He attended Yale Law School, where he was editor of the Yale Law Review. He served as a law clerk to Judge David Tatel of the D.C. Circuit and to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. After finishing his second clerkship, the one at the Supreme Court, he worked for years at the law firm of O'Melveny and Myers here in Washington. Then he joined the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. He has won numerous awards for his teaching and academic scholarship, including the highest teaching awards given at the Cal Berkeley Law School. So what's the point of this debate? We know he is well qualified. We know there is a judicial emergency that requires us to fill this seat, and we should have done it a long time ago. And when you look at his resume, it would put every lawyer, including myself, to shame when you consider all that he has done leading up to this moment in his career. Well, it turns out that those who oppose him don't oppose his qualifications. They think that he has the wrong philosophy, the wrong values. They criticize him for a handful of statements he made while he served as a professor. Isn't it interesting, the double standard that's being applied here? I was here in 2002 when a 10th Circuit Court of Appeals nominee by the name of Michael McConnell was up to be considered. He'd been a law professor at the University of Utah and the University of Chicago. At his nomination hearing, Senator Orrin Hatch, who strongly supported his nomination, said, and I quote, "I think we should praise and encourage the prolific exchange of honest and principled scholarly writing, assuming such scholars know the proper role of a judge to interpret the law as written and to follow precedent." Well, what was Senator Hatch defending in Professor McConnell's background? Well, it was the fact that he had called Roe v. Wade, a landmark Supreme Court decision, illegitimate. Professor McConnell had defended Bob Jones University's racist policies on the grounds that they were, quote, church teachings, close quote, even though the Supreme Court rejected his argument in an 8-to-1 decision. And he claimed the Violence Against Women Act was unconstitutional. Now, that was fodder for a lot of questions that should have been asked and were asked. He had made some very extreme statements as a professor. But Professor McConnell assured the Senate that when he left the classroom and entered the courtroom, he'd put his views aside and follow the law. The Senate did not stop him with a filibuster. The Senate took Professor McConnell at his word and gave him an up or down vote on the floor, and he was confirmed. That's all we're asking for when it comes to Professor Liu. I'd point out that other well-respected federal judges have also served in academic roles before coming to the bench. Richard Posner, the 7th Circuit in Chicago, is a friend of mine, and every once in a while we get together for an amazing lunch. He's such a brilliant guy. We disagree on so many things, but I can't help but sit there in awe of this man's knowledge of the law and of the world and his prolific authorship of books on so many subjects. And I think most would agree. He's taken some pretty controversial views himself. In a 2005 debate on civil liberties with Jeffrey Stone, Judge Posner said, "Life without self-incrimination clause, without the Miranda warnings, without the Fourth Amendment's exclusionary rule, with an unamended U.S. Patriot Act, with a depiction of the Ten Commandments on the ceiling of the Supreme Court, even life without Roe v. Wade would still, in my opinion anyway, be eminently worth living." Is there any fodder there for political commentators? He was a sitting judge when he said that. Some of my friends on the left could have had a field day with that quote, and some of my friends on the right might have disagreed strongly with Judge Posner's 2008, what he wrote about the 2008 Supreme Court decision in D.C. versus Heller, a case where the court stated the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, confers an individual right. Judge Posner wrote that the court's decision in Heller, quote, is questionable in both method and result, and it's evidence the Supreme Court, in deciding constitutional cases, exercises a freewheeling discretion strongly flavored with ideology, end of quote. I'll bet you there are a lot of senators on the other side of the aisle who disagree with that quote. So let's get down to the bottom line here. We recognize the value of academic freedom. We recognize the value of academic freedom and discourse. We understand that a professor has a different role in America than someone sitting on a bench judging a case. We trust them. We give them basic credit for integrity when they say they can separate the two lives. They understand the two responsibilities. Professor Liu is a man widely recognized for his integrity and independence. That's why he has the support of prominent conservative lawyers. Kenneth Starr, no hero on the Democratic side of the aisle, has said he'd be a great judge. Bob Barr, former Republican congressman, and Goldwater Institute director Clint Bolick expressed support for Liu's nomination. In fact, Ken Starr and Yale law professor Akhil Amar wrote, and I quote, "In our view, the traits that should weigh most heavily in the evaluation of an extraordinarily qualified nominee such as Goodwin are professional integrity and the ability to discharge faithfully an abiding duty to follow the law. Because Goodwin possesses these qualities to the highest degree," they wrote, "we are confident he will serve on the Court of Appeals not only fairly and competently, but with great distinction. We support and urge his speedy confirmation." End of quote. Well, we're not going to meet their wishes with a speedy confirmation. The question is whether or not 60 senators will decide today that Professor Goodwin Liu is entitled to a vote, up or down vote, in the United States Senate. Professor Liu said at his confirmation hearing, "The role of a judge is to be impartial, objective, and neutral arbiter of specific cases and controversy that come before him. And the way that process works is through absolute fidelity to the applicable precedents and the language of the law, statutes, or regulations that are at issue in this case." Professor Liu has committed to respect and follow the judicial role. I'm confident that he will fulfill that role with distinction. This is a good man, a great lawyer, an extremely well-qualified nominee. His nomination has been languishing before this Senate since February of this year. He's had to put his life on hold in many respects waiting for the Senate to act. We'll have a cloture vote in just about an hour. I think we know what's going on here. For many on the other side of the aisle, they are guided by advisors who tell them, keep as many critical judicial posts open for as long as possible. Help is on the way in the next election. We don't want to allow this president to fill these vacancies, and particularly when it comes to the circuit courts, because of the tremendous responsibility and opportunity there is for important and historic decisions. And so Professor Liu has been caught in this maelstrom. He is now going to be subjected to this filibuster vote. I sincerely hope that my colleagues will be fair and honest in their vote. I hope that they will look at the obvious record of this man to fill an important vacancy, a man found unanimously well qualified by the American Bar Association, a person with a legal resume that is peerless, someone who has stated clearly and unequivocally that he will follow the law. To dwell on statements that he has made as a professor is to do a great disservice to academic freedom and to ignore the obvious. We have, when Republican nominees came before us, used our discretion to separate out their academic lives with their promise that as judges they will look at the world in a very sober, honest way. I intend to vote to support a cloture in support of this nomination. I urge my colleagues to do the same. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Several of my colleagues have expressed concerns about the nomination of Goodwin Liu. I share many of those concerns and do not wish to belabor points that they've already made. I will limit my comments today to two fundamental reasons why I am myself unable to support the nomination of Professor Liu to serve as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. First, I'm truly dismayed by the lack of judgment displayed in Professor Liu's 2006 testimony regarding the confirmation of Samuel Alito as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Throughout extensive written testimony and during an appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Professor Liu unfairly criticized then-Judge Alito and his long judicial record as, among other things, having shown, quote, a uniform pattern of excusing errors and eroding norms of basic fairness. In particular, in the final paragraph of Professor Liu's written testimony, which served as a summary of his entire analysis on then-Judge Alito, was nothing short of an inflammatory attack. He wrote, quote, "Judge Alito's record envisions an America where police may shoot and kill an unarmed boy to stop him from running away with a stolen purse, where federal agents may point guns at ordinary citizens during a raid, even after no sign of resistance, where the FBI may install a camera where you sleep on the promise that they won't turn it on unless an informant is in the room, where a black man may be sentenced to death by an all-white jury for killing a white man." Professor Liu's unseemly attack on Justice Alito generated considerable attention at the time, as well as understandable concern about Professor Liu's temperament, his judgment, and his basic ability to be fair. So far as I know, it was only after he was nominated to become a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit that Professor Liu offered any apology for his testimony about Justice Alito. Just a few weeks ago, Professor Liu told members of the Judiciary Committee that he had learned from the outrage his remarks caused, quote, "that strong language like that is really not helpful in the process," close quote. Professor Liu's observation is certainly true, but it misses the central point. His comments about Justice Alito were offensive not simply because they were unhelpful in his confirmation process, but because they were misleading and they were an unwarranted personal attack on a dedicated judge and public servant. Professor Liu's treatment of Justice Alito and his last-minute and incomplete handling of the concerns raised by his remarks lead me to believe that he lacks the basic judgment and discretion necessary to be confirmed to a life-tenured position in the judiciary. The second reason I feel compelled to oppose this nomination has to do with the integrity of our nation's system of constitutional government and the rule of law. In my careful and considered judgment, the judicial philosophy espoused by Professor Liu is fundamentally inconsistent with the judicial mandate to be a neutral arbiter of the Constitution and to uphold the rule of law. I do not base this conclusion on the fact that his approach to the law is in many respects different from my own. That's not a prerequisite, and that's not the basis of my opposition to this nominee. Most of the judges nominated by President Obama do not share my personal textualist and originalist commitments. Yet, in my short time as a member of the Senate, I have voted to confirm many nominees with whom I fundamentally disagree. Professor Liu, by contrast, is not simply a progressive nominee with a somewhat more expansive view of constitutional interpretation than is common among many sitting judges, nor is he a nominee whose controversial remarks are few and can be overlooked given a long history of mainstream legal practice and observations. Throughout the course of his numerous speeches, articles, and books, Professor Liu has championed a philosophy that, in my judgment, is incompatible with faithfully discharging the duties of a federal appellate judge in our constitutional republic. His approach advocates that judges go far beyond the written Constitution, statutes, and decisional law to ascertain and incorporate into constitutional law, in Professor Liu's own words, shared understandings, evolving understandings, social movements, and collective values. In a 2008 Stanford Law Review article describing the judicial role, Professor Liu wrote, quote, "The problem for courts is to determine at the moment of decision whether our collective values on a given issue have converged to a degree that they can be persuasively crystallized and credibly absorbed into legal doctrine." In so framing the process of judicial decision-making, he advocated a conception of the judiciary as a, quote, "culturally situated interpreter of social meaning," close quote. In a 2009 book entitled Keeping Faith with the Constitution, he wrote that the Constitution and that constitutional interpretation rightly, quote, "incorporates the evolving understandings of the Constitution forged through social movements, legislation, and historical practice," close quote. In an interview later that year, Professor Liu suggested that the judicial role is an individual process that includes, quote, "lessons learned from experience and an awareness of the evolving norms and social understandings of our country," close quote. These are just a few examples of a clear, consistent, and extreme approach to judging that Professor Liu has championed in many settings over the course of many years. His approach necessarily requires a judge to violate separation of powers principles, making law based on the judge's subjective understanding of public opinion, communal values, historical trends, or personal preferences, rather than faithfully interpreting and applying the laws made by the legislative and executive branches. A noted judge who has faithfully served in the role to which Professor Liu has been nominated, and who as a result is intimately familiar with the very real dangers of legislating from the bench, shared this vital insight, quote, "It is as important to freedom to confine the judiciary's power to its proper scope as it is to confine that of the President, Congress, or state and local governments. Indeed, it is probably more important, for only courts may not be called to account by the public," close quote. I rise today in defense of our nation's constitutional separation of powers and ultimately in defense of the essential liberty that it protects. I also feel the need to respond to the point made by my distinguished colleague, the senator from Illinois, moments ago. This is not an opposition that is based on a disagreement with a particular set of legal analyses. My colleague from Illinois noted that there was some opposition to Judge McConnell, who was confirmed by this body to serve on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, notwithstanding the fact that many in this body disagreed with particular legal conclusions that had been reached by then Professor McConnell. This is different than that. This is not about a disagreement with a particular legal conclusion. It is instead about a concern arising out of a systemic, broad-based interpretive approach, one that I believe doesn't give due regard to the rule of law, to the notion that we are a nation that lives under the law, that our laws consist of words, that words have defined finite meaning, and that in order for our laws to work properly, that meaning needs to be respected and it needs to be interpreted in and of itself and held as an independent good by the judiciary on a consistent basis. Professor Liu's appalling treatment of Justice Alito leaves grave doubt in my mind as to whether he possesses the requisite judgment to serve as a life-tenured judge. And I have come to the conclusion that Professor Liu's extreme judicial philosophy is simply incompatible with the proper role of a judge in our constitutional republic. For these reasons, as well as those articulated by many of my colleagues, I'm compelled to oppose this nomination. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair. Madam President, I rise to support the nomination of Goodwin Liu to be a member of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. I believe that Mr. Liu's academic qualifications, strong intellect, his character, his temperament make him a person who would be a valuable addition to the federal bench, and therefore I urge my colleagues to vote for cloture and then in favor of his confirmation. Professor Liu brings an outstanding academic and professional background to this nomination and a personal life story that is quintessentially American. It's not a reason in itself, certainly, to vote to confirm him as a judge of this high court, but it speaks to the endless opportunities for upward mobility in this country for people who work hard. Where you end up is not determined by where you start out in this country. Goodwin Liu is the second son of Taiwanese immigrants. As a young boy, his family settled in Sacramento. He began to work hard from the beginning, ultimately graduating from Stanford University, received a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and eventually graduated from Yale Law School. Should he be confirmed to the Ninth Circuit, Professor Liu would become the second Asian American currently serving on a federal appeals court. He is now the Associate Dean and Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He's widely recognized and respected broadly throughout academic and legal communities in the United States. I note that prior to entering academia, he was an appellate litigator with Melviny & Myers, a first-rate firm here in Washington, and clerked for both Circuit Court Judge David Tatel and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, representing different points on the ideological legal spectrum, served them both, I know, with great distinction. Though I do not agree with everything that Goodwin Liu has ever written or said, his views, it seems to me, have been well expressed and well reasoned and quite intelligent. I think he's got a thoughtful approach to complex legal questions, and I'm impressed that he's earned the respect and support of thinkers and lawyers from all sides of the legal ideological spectrum, which I think speaks ultimately to his personal even-handedness, to the power of his intellect, and to what we can expect of him as a judge of the Circuit Court. I was particularly impressed. I know it's been quoted before, but it speaks volumes of by the comments of former Judge Ken Starr, former dean also, who said that Goodwin Liu is, and I quote, "a person of great intellect, accomplishment, and integrity, and he is exceptionally well qualified to serve on the Court of Appeals." Madam President, I know that many of my colleagues have concerns about this nomination, about things Professor Liu has either written or said, and I understand those. I have some of those concerns. I read the statement that he made about Judge Alito. It has the ring of a passionate litigator making an argument with probably more zeal than he himself appreciates as he looked at it in the aftermath. But for those who have concerns, I urge my colleagues to vote accordingly on an up or down vote not to sustain this filibuster and therefore prevent an up or down vote on this nomination. Madam President, I've always felt that in our advice and consent rule, this is my own personal reading of it, the President, by his election, earns the right to make these nominations. We don't have to decide in confirming a nominee that we would have made this nomination. Only that the nominee is acceptable, is within the range of those acceptable and capable of doing the job for which he's nominated. Not so long ago, 2005, there was a move to reduce the right to filibuster and acquire 60 votes, particularly with regard to Supreme Court nominees, but others as well. And that led to the formation of the so-called Gang of 14. I was proud to be a member of that group, and we reached an agreement, one of whose parts I want to read now. Future nominations, and this is one of them, Goodwin Liu. Signatories will exercise their responsibilities under the advice and consent clause of the United States Constitution in good faith. Nominees should only be filibustered under extraordinary circumstances, and each signatory must use his or her own discretion and judgment in determining whether such circumstances exist. End of quote from the agreement of the Gang of 14. I just don't think these are extraordinary circumstances here when you consider Goodwin Liu's intellect, his varied background, the character that he has, and this broad range of endorsements from people. To me, a disagreement about a statement made in the heat of an argument or even the substance of an article published is not strong enough to prevent this nominee from having what I think is his right and the President's right to get a vote up or down. Not to block him by requiring 60 votes. So I urge my colleagues to vote for cloture. I'm going to do so with a full measure of comfort and confidence about the kind of judge Goodwin Liu would be, but really with a full measure of comfort that I am exercising my responsibility under the advice and consent clause as I've always seen it, including as it has been informed by my proud participation in the Memorandum of Understanding of the Gang of 14 in 2005. Madam President, I thank you very much, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I would rise in regretful opposition, quite frankly, to having to vote to deny cloture for a judicial nominee. I also was in the Gang of 14, and the whole effort was to make sure that the Senate follows constitutional and historical norms, and that is giving great deference to presidential selections when it comes to judiciary. To my conservative colleagues, the best way to make sure you have conservative judges is to win elections. Because if we start blocking all the judges that we don't like that have a different view of the law than us, our friends on the other side will return the favor, and you wind up having a chaotic situation. There's a reason that Justice Ginsburg got 90-something votes and Justice Scalia got 90-something votes. It used to be the way you did business around here. When the president won the election, they were able to pick qualified nominees for the court. Unless you had a darn good reason, they went forward. And I think that should be the standard. And to me, I do give a lot of deference. It's not one speech. It's not an article. Justice Sotomayor, who I voted for, had made a famous speech that she thought the experiences of a Latino woman maybe were more valuable to the court than that of a white male. And people got up in arms about that. It bothered me. She explained herself. I looked at the way she lived her life, and I understood, based on the way she lived her life, that she was a fair person. That did not represent bigotry on her part toward white males. And we all make statements and write articles and get in debates, and I'm not going to use that as a reason to disqualify somebody from sitting on the judiciary. I wouldn't want that done to our nominees, and I don't tend to do it to the other side. But here's what Mr. Lieu did that, to me, is a bridge too far. When a conservative wins the White House, you expect people like Roberts and Alito and Scalia. When a liberal wins, you expect people like Justice Ginsburg and Elena Kagan and Sotomayor. That's the way it works. And all of them are well qualified. They just have a different approach to the law, but there are a lot of 9-0 decisions. The one thing that drives my thinking here is that Mr. Lieu chose, not in an article that he wrote as a young man, not in some debate that got carried away, but to appear before the Judiciary Committee and basically say that Judge Alito's philosophy would create an America where police may shoot and kill an unarmed boy to stop him from running away with a stolen purse. That line probably comes from some case that Judge Alito was involved in, where federal agents may point guns at ordinary citizens during a raid, even after no sign of resistance, where the FBI may install a camera where you sleep on the promise that they won't turn it on unless an informant is in the room, where a black man may be sentenced to death by an all-white jury for killing a white man, absent a multiple regression analysis showing discrimination. These statements about Judge Alito and the decisions he rendered and his philosophy are designed to basically say that people who have the philosophy of Judge Alito are uncaring, hateful, and really should be despised. That is a bridge too far, because I share Judge Alito's philosophy. And we may come out at a different result on a particular case, but I don't think I fall in the category of being hateful, uncaring, and someone you should despise. These statements given to the Judiciary Committee were designed to inflame passion against Judge Alito based on his analysis of cases before him during his judicial tenure. And if that's not enough, Justice Roberts' record, according to Mr. Lieu, suggests that he has a vision for American law, a right-wing vision antagonistic to important rights and protections we currently enjoy. It's one thing to debate your opponent. It's another thing to have strong opinions, but this is not an accidental statement. This was calculated, delivered at a time where it would do maximum damage, and all I am saying to future nominees, I expect President Obama to nominate people of a liberal judicial philosophy. I do not deny you access to the court because you may have said something in an article I don't like. You may have represented a client that I disagree with. But the one thing that I will not tolerate is for a conservative or a liberal person seeking a judgeship to basically impugn the character of the other way of thinking. These words are not that of a passionate advocate who may went too far, according to Senator Lieberman, in my view. These words were designed to destroy, and they ring of an ideologue. And he should be running for office, not sitting on the court. There's a place for people who think this way about conservative judicial philosophy. Run for president. Run for the Senate. Don't sit on the court. Because the court has to be a place where you accept differences, you hash it out, you render verdicts, and based on the way he views Justice Alito and Roberts and his disdain for their philosophy, I do not believe he could give someone like me a fair shake. So at the end of the day, I ask one thing of my Democratic colleagues. I will try my best to make sure the Senate stays on track and that we do not get in the road of filibustering judges haphazardly based on the fact that it's somebody we don't agree with. I've tried my best not to go down that road because I think it will destroy the judiciary and disrupt the Senate. If you're a conservative in the future wanting to be a judge and you come before our committee when a liberal nominee is before the committee and you question their patriotism and you suggest that they're hateful people who should be despised for their philosophy, then I will render the same verdict against you. We want people on the court who are well-rounded, who are qualified, who understand that America is a big place, not a small place. In Mr. Liu's world, I think he has a very small view of the law. Those on the other side who think differently should be engaged intellectually or challenged through academic debate. He's tried to basically rip their character apart, and he will not get my vote. And a conservative who feels the same way about liberal philosophy would not get my vote either. I'm looking for the model of where Miguel Estrada, who was poorly treated, wrote a letter on behalf of Lena Kagan saying she was my law school classmate. We don't agree on much when it comes to the law, but she's a wonderful person, well qualified, deserves to be on the bench. That's the way conservatives and liberals should engage each other, in my view, when it comes to the judicial nomination process. This was a bridge too far for Lindsey Graham. I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I'd like to